Greetings, my green-fingered motion graphic designers. I thought a good compliment for the infinite blooming flower would be to animate a growing stalk. So please grab your flower pots and let's go. To start with, I'll create a simple cube, just for scale. And then I'm thinking the front view, I'm going to create one of my favorite things, a spline. I'll make it a B-spline because that's simple and smooth. Set a point out there, and there, and there. So this, with a few little tiny tweaks, is going to be the basic shape of our stalk. Let's also make sure that the first point is at the absolute center of our scene. And now we can go ahead and delete the cube because we don't need it anymore. Instead, I'll just select the spline and create myself a bend deformer. And for once, the bend deformer bends on the right goddamn axis. Let's just make the size of the bend 100 on X and Z, then 250 on the Y. And I'll also check keep y-axis length. And as I turn the power up, it just curls up into a little ball. And that is just what I want for the sprout. So I think 570 is just about enough. And then when I animate this up on the y-axis, it will also unroll kind of like a plant does as it grows. Which is exactly what I wanted to do. So let me just go into the coordinates here, zero out the X and Z position, and then set a keyframe for the Y position. Over the course of 100 frames, I'm going to animate it so it just moves right past the top of our stalk, so it unrolls completely. Once I've done that, I want to select the last keyframe and make sure it eases in. I think an easing time of 40 frames should be enough. Yes, that's good. However, it does need a few more segments, so I'm going to go into our spline and change the mode from adaptive to natural, just like that. And now as it unrolls, it's completely smooth. Right, so I want to group this and call that group main, because this is our main spline. And then I'll also create a MoSpline and change the mode from simple to spline. And in spline, I'm going to drag in our freshly created main spline. So now we have a MoSpline doing that same thing, to which we can add loads of effectors. But I'll immediately go into fields and change it from exclude to include. So if we create any forces in our scene, it doesn't just fuck up our MoSpline. So the next step would be to create some swirly vines that grow up together with this plant. And I'm going to use a helix to do that with. Let's set that to the X and Z plane, so it moves up. I want it to start quite small, around 5 centimeters maybe, and then end around 5 centimeters as well. Now this needs to go into a null, and with the spline in this null, I'm going to put a spline wrap, because now we're actually going to spline wrap a spline around another spline. Let's rename this twirls. So let's add in our MoSpline as the reference for the spline wrap. And well, that's on the wrong axis. So let's change that to wrap along the y-axis. Let's also make sure we change the mode from fit to spline to keep length, so that our vines can be whatever length they want to be. Let's hide our spline wrap, and then I want to tweak the twirl a bit, make the base a bit bigger, and then have it swirl around a bit more. Then I'll copy this a few times and just give it some variation. So now I have 3 different vines here, and they follow our main spline as it grows out thanks to our spline wrap. But I do want our vines to grow as well, so I'm going to need to turn them to a MoSpline too. So I'm going to make all of these editable and then connect and delete them. So now I have a single editable object with all our helixes in. Now let's do the same thing for this that we did for our main spline. Let's copy the original MoSpline and name that one MoMain, because that's our main spline. And name our copy MoTwirls. Then we're going to reference our helixes in our MoTwirl MoSpline. Then I'll have to move the MoSpline out of the null, so it's not affected by our spline wrap. But if we group that again, name it twirls as well, we can move our MoSpline into that null instead, so it still gets to be among friends. So now we can animate our vines as well by keyframing the end value in our MoSpline. Currently they all grow one by one because the grow mode is set to complete spline, but if we just switch that to separate segment, they will all grow together as one. So at frame 0, I want the end value to be 0%, Then I want the vines to grow over 5 seconds. So at frame 125, I'm going to set the value to 100%. Now those are going to slowly grow out as the main stalk just unfolds. Let's do the same with this animation that we did for the other one. Let's ease the end keyframe out. This one I'll set to 50 frames. So now it ends real nice and slow. Perfecto. Now, a flower stalk without leaves doesn't really do it for me. So I'll go through and do pretty much the exact same thing that I did for our infinite blooming flower tutorial and just create a leaf that we can attach to the stem. So this here is our basic leaf shape. Naturally, it needs a little bit of thickness to it, so I will go to Simulate and add this into a cloth nerves. Turn off the subdivisions in there and add about a 1 centimeter thickness. Now naturally I want to have a little bit of a stem for this leaf as well, and I'll use just a simple cylinder for that. Now that'll do just fine. I need a few more segments in it so we can bend this later. Let's group these two together. Rename that leaf 1 because this is going to be the first one. Then I'll make sure that the pivot point of the null is right at the base of our cylinder. And that way we can rotate this properly later and attach it properly to our stem. Now, let's add our bend deformer, which as always is on the wrong axis. So let's just rotate this around and scale it so it fits perfectly just mostly around the stem of our leaf. Just like that. Fits perfectly and it starts bending just at the base. So if I bend this 90 degrees, that looks quite a bit like a leaf. So let's just attach this to our stalk. And to do that, I will use the classic align to spline tag. The spline path we want to reference is our main MoSpline. And in the precision, we're just going to turn up our percentage so it sits just about where we want it to. But it's pointing right down at the ground, which is not right. So to fix that, we need to group leaf 1 and add our align to spline tag to our parent null instead. And let's call the parent null leaf 1 because it's still leaf 1. And at this point, let's just have a look through and see what it looks like. Our stalk unrolls as it does, and the leaf kind of sits where it's supposed to, but we would like that to follow the rotation of the sprouting stalk as well. To do that, we could either tap tangential on our align to spline tag, and that kind of does, well, it tries to do what we want it to, but it kind of fails miserably. Plus it would look a bit more slick if it had a tiny delay to the rotation. So the alternative method is to add a target tag to our leaf 1 object. Then we create a new null and copy our align to spline tag to that null. Let's rename the null target. And then we have the null offset slightly ahead of our leaf. And then we can use our target null as the target object for our target tag. So now our leaf is just going to keep pointing at that null. And as it animates, it fucks up the same way, but we have a bit of a delay. And the fuck up is quite easy to fix using an up vector. And that just requires a new null, which we will move off to the side. And I'm going to move this in front of our plant. And then I will name it appropriately up vector. And I will drag that up vector null into our up vector slot of our target tag. Now when we play back, our leaf is stable. Now we just need to rotate this around so it's pointing the right way. And now I can also see that the leaf stem is far too big, so I'm just gonna fix that real quick. That's better. Now I also want the leaves to grow, and I'm just gonna do that by animating the scale. Around frame 50, I want the animation of the leaf to start, so I'm going to set the size to be something really tiny, so it's pretty much invisible. I'm going to go for 0.01, and then set a keyframe for that. Jump ahead. So at frame 130, I'm going to have it grow to its full size. And actually, it looks a bit big there, so I'm going to scale down the child null a little bit, so it looks a bit nicer. It's about time for another playthrough now. So we can see that it has progressed. Still looks a bit rough around the edges, but it will look better. I'm going to go ahead and create another leaf. So first I'm going to create a null to put both leaves in, and I'll name that null leaves, and then put the first leaf in there. And then I'll pretty much just copy that one and then just offset it slightly and make it a little bit different. Right, so now I have my stalk here with its 2 leaves, and they're both growing together, looking quite nice. Now what's left to do is to add some geometry to the main MoSpline and to these twirlies. So I'm just going to add my main spline to a sweep and add a circle to that sweep. And that sweep is tiny. That's just because it's using the MoSpline thickness as a rail spline. So if we just uncheck that, it is now massive. So I'm going to turn down the size of my circle, set it to 10. Then I'll go into the details of the sweep and just draw a curve in the scale. So it starts kind of thick and then just gradually becomes more narrow towards the top. And then this is what we have. Something that looks kind of like a flower. Probably don't need it quite that high res, so I'll set the intermediate points of my circle spline to natural and just turn that down. So we save some processing power. Right, so now the whole thing just grows and looks pretty good. And I'll just do the exact same thing with the twirls. And now this is what our whole growing stalk looks like. It's got the main spline growing in, it's got the twirlies growing in, and the leaves coming out. Looks pretty okay. But it still looks a bit grey. So I do want some sort of material in this, and I've got the flower petal material we did in our infinite blooming flower tutorial. And with a few tweaks, I can reuse this. I'm going to want to make it green, but first off, I'll add it to our main stalk. So it looks like this. It's fine, but let's turn these blue colors into green colors. And to do that, I turn those blue colors to green colors. And then believe it or not, the colors are green. Whoa. Now it does have a blue glow in here, which I don't actually mind. I'll just need to go into the material and flip that on the vertical axis so that the glow is right at the top. I want that same material on my twirls. And same thing with the twirls, need to flip that on the vertical. And then I'll copy that to the leaves, but with the leaves we can see that we have some ugly stretchy UVs. And that's thanks to our subdivision surface that we have. We just need to go into those and change the way it treats the UVs to boundary. So now our UVs are nice and smooth, but we will need to make a new material for our leaves. I'll start out by naming the one we have to stalks. That will be for the stalks, and then copy that one. And with that copy being for our leaves, I will rename that copy leaves. First thing we need to change for the material is our glowing gradient. Right now that one is on the V axis. I'll swap it so it's on the U axis. And then I'll drag that material to our leaves. You can see that it's right at the base of the leaf. And let's also change the colors so that one is also on the U axis before we go into the material tag and flip it on the U axis. So now the tippy tops of our leaves are glowing blue. So let's give that a render. And it looks quite nice. But right now, our stalk is actually missing a bud, which I want to crack open and start blooming after it's finished growing. And to create that, I will actually start with a sphere. I'm going to give this sphere 6 segments in total. Make it editable. And then I will actually delete all segments except for one series of segments along the y-axis, like that. And then I'm going to select the remaining segments and dissolve those. So those are actually just one single n-gon now. And then I'll also go to optimize and get rid of all the extra points that we have. Right, so let's reshape this into a bit more of a bud. I'll just move these points down a bit, also scale them down a bit. Now obviously this is just one part of the bud, and to get the other parts I'm going to put this into a cloner object. I don't want any movement on the Y position, but I do want to rotate it around, so I'm going to set the heading to 60 degrees per clone. And if I set the count to 6, that's just going to clone all the way around, so we get a round shape again. I'm going to add that to a cloth surface, leave the subdivisions, and just add a bit of a thickness to it. Maybe that's enough. Then I'll add that one into a subdivision surface. And now we have somewhat of a bud shape. And to avoid the UV problem that we had with the leaves earlier, let's just set the subdivide UVs to be boundary immediately. Then we can group this up into a null that I would recommend calling bud, because it is the bud after all. Now let's add our stock material to it. And it works just fine. Now this needs to move with the rest of the plant, obviously, so I will use another line to spline tag with that. And the spline path in question I want to reference is the main MoSpline, the main. I'll make sure to put the bud right at the top, right at 100%. And then I'll need to check tangential, so it orients the right way around. And now it's on the wrong axis. And to fix that, once again, let's just group the bud and add our line to spline tag to the parent object. And then we can rotate the child object freely to just make sure it's pointing the right way. And while we do that, we could also scale it down so it's also the right size. I think 0.3 is a pretty good number. Actually, maybe 0.2 even on the X and Z. And 0.25 on the Y, so it's just a bit slimmer. I think this looks reasonable for a flower, at least for an alien flower. I mean, you've not seen one, you can't tell me otherwise. So yeah, this is exactly what an alien flower looks like, except that they probably have the bud grow with the rest of the plant. So let's animate that. At frame 125, let's set the size to be 100%. And have it start around frame 30 from a very tiny size. Let's say 20% scale. And set more keyframes for that. So now this bud is going to grow as the rest of the flower just animates out. That's okay, but it's not right. I'm going to need to offset the anchor point of this child null so that the bud actually scales up from the base so it doesn't scale from the middle, because that looks just a bit wrong. So let's just move the axis point down to the bottom here and zero out the position. And as you can see, it kind of jumps up now. So we'll need to tweak our line to spline tag and just move it back down just so it sits nicely at the top of the stalk. And now if we play it through, our bud grows from the base. And that looks a lot more plausible. So let's animate this bud cracking open then. To do that, I'll go down to the single bud polygon that we have. And as a child of that, I want a simple plane effector. I'm going to reset PSR for that, so that one just moves into place where it's supposed to be. Then I'll go into the deformer tab and set that one to polygon deformation. So now if I change these values, you can see, maybe if I turn these off, you can see that it does actually move the thing, and that's actually moving the polygons. I do primarily want to animate the rotation for this. You can see if I change the pitch rotation, it kind of rotates back and then disappears into nothing. And that's going to be the basis of our cracking bud animation. And with the full bud turned on, you can see how the rotation kind of gives that look of a cracking bud actually. So I'll set that to around -90, so it's pretty much completely flat. And then I also want to tweak the precision so it also moves down a little bit and stays more or less in the center. So now if I change the strength of the effector, it does that full animation. And it's all about finding the right values. This one needs a bit more tweaking, especially like in the precision. And I think to make it look less messy when it collapses, I will change the scale on the x-axis to be, I think, -1. And then it just kind of moves out the way. And I want it to move on the z-axis as well. So now if I animate the strength, it does look pretty good actually. Right, so let's set a few more keyframes then, shall we? I reckon right after the plant is finished growing, the bud should crack open. So I'll set a keyframe here for 0%, jump ahead a little bit, and then turn it up to 100. And then it cracks open like that. Beautiful. Let's look at the whole thing, shall we? Plant grows, bud grows, leaves come in, bud cracks open. Boink. Looks quite nice, but it could be a lot smoother. So now I get to add my favorite deformer to our base spline, the jiggle deformer. And this is basically magically going to make our entire animation look natural. Let's turn down the stiffness all the way down to 5. Structural, I want at 50. Drag can stay at 10, but under advanced, I want to turn down the number of springs to 2 and the iterations to 2 as well. And that's just going to add a little extra smoothness. And would you look at that, how lovely and organic that looks. I swear, like, the jiggle is magic. All that's left to do with this is to add in the flower from the previous tutorial, so we have something blooming after the bud cracks open. I have it in my pasteboard, so I'll just paste that one right in. And it is way too big. No worries, we'll sort that out. Let's start by scaling the whole thing down. I'm going to set that to 1/10 of the scale. And go into our flower object and turn off the jiggle that we had there. And I think I might actually want it slightly smaller. I'm going to turn that down to 0.08. Right, so let's just give this a quick playback to see what it looks like. The flower starts blooming immediately, and it doesn't stick to the top, but we will fix that. Let's just move the flower down to start with, and copy the align to spline tag we have on our bud. So now at least stick to the top. It's facing the wrong way, but we know how to fix that though. Let's group our flower, put the tag on the parent, and then we can just make sure to rotate the flower around so it faces the right way. Let's first just play ahead to a point when it's kind of stopped so we see which axis is actually the right axis. And then let's spin it around 90 degrees. Beautiful. Now what we want to do is just time up the flower so it starts blooming just after the bud is cracked open. And that sort of stuff is best done with the timeline, so let me bring that up. Keyframes we'll want to shift are these petal keyframes, so I'm just going to shift those so they happen just slightly before the bud starts cracking open, maybe 10 or so frames. I'm kind of looking at the size of the flower, just making sure that it fits within the bud. I think maybe 15 frames is the number to go for. So let's see what that looks like when it's played through. Timing looks about right, but what doesn't look right is the positioning of the flower. I'm going to need to move that down. So I'll change the position in our align to spline tag to something slightly lower, just so it sits right on the top of the plant. Right, so that part is done. Now let's turn back on our jiggle deformer that we have in our flower. And you will see, once this settles, you will be able to see that it looks messed up. It looks just totally messed up. Well, it's an alien flower, so maybe messed up is the way it's supposed to look, but I don't think it is. And that's just because we have a turbulence force in here, which is set to a scale way higher than the flower currently is. We scaled it down to about 1/10 of its size, so let's turn down the power of the turbulence to 1/10 as well. But I'll leave the scale and frequency about the same, because that looks pretty good like this. And that is basically it. Rendering this now, it would look like this. Of course, there's endless possibilities with techniques like these. Maybe you don't even have to do an alien flower. Maybe you could do an earth flower. But for now, I'd like to thank you for your time. And until next time, remember to water these plants at least twice a day, 4 times on Sundays, and to stay in motion.